Welcome, everyone, to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host, Joseph Glore, and with me in the studio, as always, is His Excellency, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, glad to be with you here in Santa Barbara.
Joe, always a joy to be with you.
Well, you know, Bishop, it's been a fun day. We got a bunch of videos recorded today for our YouTube series, and last night, you got your books in.
Yeah, so I think about 100 copies of the new book, my book with John Allen, came yesterday. And I must say, it's always a thrill because books, I've written a number of books now, and they're a long process, you know, from the moment you're thinking about it to the actual composition. This one was a little bit different because it was interviews with John that we had to edit. But, you know, it's a long process of editing and thinking and writing and going back. And so when the book finally comes, it's always a joy, like, okay, we got it done, you know. But also, I always feel the same way. I always feel like, okay, what's the next one? You know,
I hear that. I hear a lot of authors say that.
The minute the book comes, it's like, okay, that one's done. Now what's next?
As soon as you get it in your hands and you're thumbing through it, you're already thinking, okay, what's
next?
Well, what's next for today? We got to record this show, and then we've got a special visitor coming at 3 o'clock.
Oh, yeah, right. The papal ninja's coming. I haven't met him yet, but those who watch the American Ninja Warrior show, you know, which is really popular, I've seen it a number of times. These guys going through this really, really complicated obstacle course, and they're really fine athletes, you know, all of them. Well, anyway, this fella who calls himself the Papal Ninja because he's got a strong Catholic identity and background, it turns out is a Word on Fire fan. And so, to make a long story short, we invited him to come, and he's coming today. And I'm just eager to meet him, and we'll talk about, you know, I think he's in his mid-20s, upper 20s, something like that.
He looks a little
you know, talk about maybe evangelizing his generation. So I'm eager to meet him.
It's been cool watching him. I watched a show, and he wears the Vatican flag as his T-shirt when he's going through, and he's got some Dominican priests that are
cheering for him.
So he's fully Catholic presence on NBC primetime. So it's
cool.
It's a cool way to evangelize the culture. So I think, it'll be interesting to meet him.
I look forward to our conversation tonight.
Well, going back to your book that you just thumbed through for the first time as a hardcover last night, the name of the book, of course, is To Light a Fire on the Earth. And we are really excited about launching this book. I'm personally excited about it because it is the most personal book that you've written. So what I thought we'd do for today's episode is go through the order of your life and talk about 5 men who've been a great influence on you and helped you become the man that you are today. Who would you say would be the first man to really make an impact on your life?
Well, there's no question. John Clayton Barron Sr., my father. My father was a great man. He died way too young. He died when he was only 65, and I was ordained all of 1 year when he died. So my father never saw any of you know, the work that I did as a priest. He saw me ordained a priest. I'm really happy about that, but he died way too young. My father was just the finest person I've ever known. I've never known anyone of greater integrity. That's the word that comes to my mind. I was just reading, in fact, last night in David Brooks's book on character. He has a section on George Marshall, you know, the great World War II general. And everyone said the same thing. They all used the word integrity when talking about him. And as I was reading that, I was thinking, yeah, that's my father. He was a man of, you know, values like redwood trees, you know, like just strong and simple and clear. It would never have occurred to him to compromise his moral integrity. And that's what I most admired about him. You know, and man for others, unconditional love, I mean, all those terms that we throw around. That was my father. And in the way typical of his generation, he belonged to, you know, what we call now the greatest generation. And there really was something about that generation that, man, it's sad that we're losing it. Simple, not drawing attention to himself, very aware of the importance of humility, of quietly doing your duty. You know?
A stoicism.
Yeah, that was my father. Not showy for a second. That's why I've always reacted against I'd call it sort of a neo-Freudianism that would say, you know, especially your men have to be showing their emotions all the time.
Be vulnerable, especially in the Christian world. That's like the number one thing in young men's groups is like, oh man, it was so vulnerable, you know. Love that you cried.
I don't know. I never saw my father cry in all my life, and my father was not an emotionally sort of forthcoming person, but I never doubted for a second that my father loved me unconditionally. He would take a bullet for me. Well, I remember this is got toward the end of his life, but when the hostage crisis was going on in Iran, remember this back in the, late 70s, early 80s, and my brother is saying to me, and just saying it blithely without any exaggeration, he goes, yeah, if you and I were over there, Dad would have had us out by now. Right. Like he just would have. My father just would have commandeered a helicopter or something, and he would have gotten us out. But it was that sort of fundamental moral integrity, living for the other, that whenever I think of the moral life, or I think of a model for my life, my father comes right to my mind. He's number one influence.
What about your Catholicism? I mean, he was a churchman?
He was, but in a completely, again, non-ostentatious way. My father's generation had a thing about wearing religion on your sleeve. They just didn't like it. It would never have occurred to my father in a million years to miss Mass on Sunday. I mean, he would sooner cut his right arm off than miss Mass on Sunday. He was not showy in his religious faith, but it was, again, redwood tree kind of stuff. It was just fundamental, basic, and that was communicated. One of my very earliest memories, I'm a little kid now, 4 years old maybe, I'm at Mass on Sunday. My father was not tall, but he was a big guy. He was a athlete when he was a young man, a gymnast and all that. Big, muscular guy. And I thought he was, the biggest, strongest, coolest person in the world when I was a little kid. And seeing my father kneeling at Mass, and again, not in a showy, hyper-emotional, hey, look at me sort of way, not at all, but just this humble, clean gesture of humility. It stayed in my 4-year-old mind, and it still does to this day, that here's the strongest guy I know and the most together person I know, and he's kneeling before something more powerful.
That's a lovely vulnerability, if you ask me.
Yeah, if you want to use that terminology.
Yeah,
he would never have wanted to read it in the kind of the Oprah way.
Right. If for people that are looking for that, I think that it is expressive of what they're getting at.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as you move on now towards high school and you're looking towards your teachers, I was a high school teacher. Was there any high school teachers or any other influences?
Well, yeah, I've spoken of him before, but Father Tom Paulson, who taught religion at Fenwick High School and introduced me to St. Thomas Aquinas, had a absolutely life-changing impact on me. I had him, for one class of religion, so he didn't have that sort of steady influence, but that moment, that class of teaching me Thomas Aquinas, I was a teacher for a long time too, and I think most teachers don't realize that there could be this moment. I mean, you're just doing your thing.
Totally.
But you have no idea at that moment this seed is getting planted, which, like in my case, as in every relevant sense, has led to what I'm doing right now. It was planted that day by him. So I want to pay tribute to him. But the guy I'm thinking of who had probably a more enduring impact on me was Mr. Tim White. And Tim is still in the land of the living. He's a deacon back in the Chicago area. And he was a teacher at Bennet Academy, which is this great Benedictine high school outside Chicago. He was a teacher there for 50 years.
Wow.
And came as a very young man, found his vocation. No question about it. Vocation was to teach in that high school. Stayed for 50 years. One of my favorite things, someone told me that, he taught generations of students, right? That this girl in his class was acting a certain way, and he said, you're just like your grandmother. He taught 3 generations of the same family,
Wow.
Anyway, but Tim White taught me, and a lot of things, but one was just the joyfulness he had in exploring the life of the mind. He taught English, and when we had him in senior year, his requirement was that everyone in the class had to keep a journal. And by journal, he meant not like just sharing your personal feelings, but it was you had to write something every day. It could be a poem, it could be a story, you could be writing the novel of your life, but you had to write something every day. Mm-hmm. And man, was that a good discipline.
Yeah.
And I remember to this day, I still have it, in my little senior high school handwriting. But I wrote all kinds of stuff, whatever's on my mind, And we would hand these things in, and then he would read them, and he would make comments. And he lived for those comments. Like, what does he think about what I wrote? But I remember he was saying a number of things. But at one point, and I was not writing in an explicitly religious way that often, but he wrote in the thing, "Have you ever thought about the priesthood?" And it was like he saw something. I was, in fact, kind of starting to think about it, but I wasn't writing like, oh, I'm thinking about the priesthood. But he said, have you ever thought about the priesthood? And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh, yeah, God, maybe there really is something there. That I was sort of afraid to talk about it, but he allowed me to externalize it. But he also taught me really how to read great texts. My own book, And Now I See, I have this long section on Faulkner's great story, The Bear, which is one of the masterpieces of short fiction in the 20th century. And basically, it's Mr. White's reading of it, that I just kind of slightly adapted for my own purposes. But he taught me how to take a great text like that and see it deeply and symbolically and with its overtones and undertones. And that was just key at that point in my life and gave me a great enthusiasm for writing. I wouldn't have guessed it at that point, when I was 17. Would I write, 17 books and spend most of my life writing? Probably not. But he lit a spark that has continued, glowing all these years.
Yeah, I would say 2 marks of a great teacher that I heard is, number one, he's passionate about what he's teaching. I had a professor in college that taught Restoration literature, and he said everyone thinks this is the most boring era of literature ever. But he was so passionate, it ended up becoming my favorite class.
Yeah.
And then also noticing his students. It's amazing what that does to a teenage mind.
Yeah, and you're writing something when you're 17, and you think, oh gosh, move over Shakespeare. And, for him, it was probably like, oh, God, one more, 17-year-old, But that he took the time to write extensively, He responded in a way that lit a fire in me, So I think of him. Tim White was a big impact on me.
What about college? As you head out there, you went to seminary straight out of high school?
No, I went to the University of Notre Dame my first year, and I was studying, I was freshman, so we weren't really declared, but I was going to study philosophy. I was thinking about the priesthood kind of vaguely. I knew I loved philosophy, the life of the mind. My family always had a great affection for Notre Dame, so I was accepted. I went there my first year, loved it. But during that year, the priesthood thing began to grow on me. And then I left Notre Dame and went to the college seminary in Chicago. And then from there, I got a scholarship called the Basilian Scholarship, which is a wonderful thing. It's been around now for about 100 years.
Academic scholarship, yeah?
Yeah, to Catholic University of America. And some of the great prominent figures in 20th century Catholicism got the Basilian Scholarship. And I think of Cardinal Wuerl of Washington was a Basilian.
And your friend from Houston, right? Bishop
Cardinal DiNardo, that's right. DiNardo was a Basilian. Cardinal Burke was a Basilian. Fulton Sheen taught the Basilians when he was at Catholic U. So, I got that scholarship, went to Catholic U. And when I was there, I met a third person I draw attention to as a huge influence, and that was Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, Father Sokolowski at the time, professor of philosophy at Catholic U. Started teaching there, I think, in the early 60s. He's been there forever. Now he's a man, I think, in his about 80 years old. When I had him, he would have been in his 40s, I guess, kind of right in the heart of his career. And he's one of those people, I think back on it now, I liked all my teachers there, but there's something about him. It was not just what he taught, it was him, it was his personality. It was his style. It was his way of being in the world that struck us, He was a priest, and he was a priest. He was kind of a man's man type, and a priest. Of course, wore the collar at a time when it wasn't always in vogue to wear the collar. But much more than that, you could tell the collar was just an externalization of what was deep, deep, deep in him, his identity as a priest. He communicated the life of the mind to us in a really compelling way. It's a bit of a cliche to say it, but someone who's not just teaching philosophy, but who's philosophizing. And I always found in my time as a teacher, always trying to do that, not just convey data about theology, but actually to theologize and teach students how to do that and to light a fire around that theme, So Sokolowski did that. And I think, too, of many of the themes I've developed in my own intellectual life, go back through my books, a lot of them are just Sokolowski themes that I've internalized. And, I think it was Chesterton said that originality is by far the most overrated virtue in the life of the mind, because no one really is all that original. I mean, we all taking in what we learned, and then we're kind of repackaging it, representing it, giving it a different spin.
Even Aquinas, you were saying.
Of course, yeah. I mean, Thomas takes in huge influences,
Right.
As I took in Aquinas. But Sokolowski was that for me, someone he traded in sort of master ideas, not just the data of learning a topic, but what are the master ideas that govern this area of life? But see, I want to press it too. It's more than just that. It was his way of being in the world. Again, integrity. He was like my father that way, and so was Tim White. The integrity of the moral life. All that. Imagine you're 20 years old, and it's your life's about to sort of take off. Here's what I want to do.
You're deciding what kind of priest you want to be.
Right. And God sends someone like, okay, that's it.
It's cool.
And I'm not like him in many ways. I mean, people wouldn't say, oh, he's just like Sokolowski.
Right.
I'm really not in terms of personality, but it's a deeper thing. It was a deeper kind of commitment of life. And God, I think, yes, puts those people in your path and says, okay, there it is. And so, of course, he taught us Aristotle. And Aristotle is famous for his unique articulation of the moral life, which is, what's the right thing to do? It's what the good man does. It's a very interesting way to think about it. It's not an abstract, deductive approach to ethics, like, oh, here's the good, and then you do this and that, and here's what follows from these principles.
It's the good man.
No. Find the good man.
Yeah.
Okay, there's one.
Right.
Now, what does he do? Watch him, and now do what he does.
Yeah.
Now, then think about it if you want after that. But see, what he's noticing is what Aristotle would have called virtue. Virtus is a power, and of course, the word vir, manly. It's got the idea of manliness behind it. You see, who's a good man in this community? Now, watch him, apprentice to him. And that's, I think, what a lot of us did with Sokolowski is we just kind of, we watched him, we apprenticed to him, and we did what he did. I think that's why he impacted me. So you could look at my writing and say, oh, there's the Sokolowski influence, as many have done.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about him when you're talking about ideas.
Absolutely, like especially God's non-competitive transcendence. I got that from him.
Yeah.
And then I've just sort of rung the changes on it in my own way, and
right.
in light of things going on and all that. But it was more the way he was, the way he was as a person. He was a good man that we tended to imitate. We wanted his virtue in us.
Now you become a priest. You're an ordained priest. Who's the big influence on your life then as you start your work actually in the church?
I can say it unequivocally. It was Monsignor William Quinn. I'm 26. I'm newly ordained. I'm at St. Paul the Cross Parish in Park Ridge, Illinois, right? And I show up at this parish. I knew the pastor, Joe Kinane, another splendid person. I knew Joe a little bit. But I get there, and I realize that living across the hall from me is this elderly priest. And, I didn't know him from Adam. Bill Quinn. He introduced himself. Hi, I'm Bill Quinn. And so I'm kind of a gregarious guy, and so we'd be at lunch or something or dinner, and I would say, hey, Bill, what's going on? Because he, a very humble man, and so didn't advertise all this. But as we're talking, I realized, he was at Vatican II. And I'd say,
wow.
You were at Vatican II? He goes, yeah, I was in Rome during those years. Oh, wow. What were you doing over there? I was a liaison between the American Bishops' Conference and the Latin American Bishops' Conference. Wow, really? How did that happen? Well, I got involved with Cesar Chavez. And you were involved with Cesar Chavez? Oh, yeah. He spoke at my 25th anniversary as a priest. Wow, really? And then I say, well, boy, how did all that happen? And he goes, well, I was... back before the council, I was working in Latin America with a lot of the people that eventually became the liberation theologians, like, Gustavo Gutierrez. And I said, you knew Gustavo Gutierrez? And well, then I love this because, I must confess, when I first met him, there was a little bit of like, is this guy for real? Is he making this stuff up?
Right.
Well, I remember Gutierrez himself was appearing at the University of Michigan. So Bill said to me, why don't we go? Let's go to his talk, And so I drove him. We drove to Ann Arbor from Chicago. And we get there, and Gutierrez is about, if you ever seen him, like 4 feet tall. Like this tiny little man, right? Bill was 6'4", tall, thin, 6'4". So we get there, and I remember Gutierrez comes out before the talk. He's kind of milling around. So Bill goes up to him, and I'm in tow,
It's that big test.
And little Gutierrez goes, Bill, and then hugs him, So I thought, okay, he's not just, playing games with me here. Anyway, so Bill had this wonderful, fascinating career as a priest and did a lot of great, heroic things, working for social justice especially. Bill Quinn, and he was my introduction to the world of Reynold Hillenbrand. So Hillenbrand, little did I ever suspect I would be his successor one day as rector of Mundelein, but he was the rector of Mundelein back when Bill was a student, And Hillenbrand is the one that linked liturgy and social justice and, did a lot of that work that Dorothy Day was doing and, Jacques Maritain and Thomas Merton, all those people. And so Bill was influenced profoundly by Hillenbrand. And then there I was now, 26-year-old, and here's this now 70-year-old guy telling me stories about Hillenbrand,
so cool.
telling me about what it was like in the 40s and 50s. And so we spent 3 years together, 1986 through 89, when I went off to study to Paris. And Bill was like a grandfather figure to me. My own father died, as I mentioned, young in 1987. And I think it's kind of a wonderful detail of God's providence that when my own father died, Bill was there. He was not a substitute, of course, but he was kind of like a father figure to me. In fact, Bill read the homily I wrote for my father's funeral because it was a terrible time and it was kind of a shock, his death.
Too early.
So I wasn't up to giving the homily, but I wrote it, and Bill Quinn read it at my father's funeral.
Wow.
So I think of him as a sort of father figure that was sent to me, but he had a big impact on just the way I thought about priesthood. Every day I talked to him. So almost every day I'd go to his room at some point, and I'd say, Bill, this happened to me, and this and this and that, and he would give me advice, or he would encourage me. I remember, here's a real practical thing. The first time I gave a talk, I'm at the Paul Cross Parish in the basement, and I was offering an adult education thing, So I'm nervous, and he goes to me before, how many people are you expecting? I said, oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, maybe 50. He goes, put out 25 chairs. And he said, make it look like it's the hottest ticket in town.
Oh, okay.
And I've never forgotten that. I do it to this day.
Yeah.
What are you expecting? Put out half the number of chairs. He said, you want people coming and go, hey, we got a chair? Oh, they're in the other room, I guess. And he said, never have it like I got 100 chairs and
That's
20
smart,
show up. Anyway, so from the most practical to the most sublime. And he introduced me to all kinds of people in his world, So Bill was a dear guy and a great guy. I dedicated one of my books to him. But I think of him as a real mentor in those early years of priesthood.
Moving on towards your life as a rector, your life as the host of the Catholicism series, I think I know who the fifth guy is going to be.
Yeah, it's Cardinal George. It's really funny even now as I'm talking to you about this, I think of my father, starting with him, but that all these people in different ways really were like iterations of my father. They had some aspect of his, personality. They all have that quality of integritas, that my father had, simplicity, directness. So Cardinal George, who comes in my life when I was, 1997 he arrived, so I was, just 11 years ordained at that point. Turns out he had a big impact on me because he, in a way, took me under his wing, and brought me to his house and urged me to work kind of with him on this whole project of evangelizing the culture. In many ways, what you and I are doing right now is the result of Cardinal George, because he drew me into this work of evangelizing, and from that Word on Fire came. He really is the grandfather of Word on Fire and gave me enormous encouragement in doing this kind of work. I remember after I was giving talks in downtown Chicago to business people, and their lunch hour. And he got that. He was kind of a Cardinal Newman type guy, like get a bunch of people in a room and give them a talk, And I said, well, Your Eminence, it's a great thing, and I'm happy to do it. But I said, we could reach so many more if we reached out through the new media and social media. He never understood. He never used it, but he totally got that. When I proposed the Catholicism series, he got right behind it, gave me all the permission I needed, all the latitude to get that done. But it's not just those practical things, but it was Cardinal George as a priest, and to watch the integrity of his own priesthood, a man of mission, of duty. As I say, I had the privilege of living with him for about 6 years, on and off. So I saw him up close, and I realized I think I have a busy schedule. He had morning, noon, night, every day, 7 days a week.
Never complained.
Right, and that's what struck me was, it was doing this meeting, it was going to this group, it was traveling there to give this talk. It was never once in 6 years, honestly, never once I ever hear Cardinal George say, "Oh God, oh brother, I got this coming up." Oh, never. It was, this is it. I'm doing it. It's my responsibility. His love for the priesthood and for priests was extraordinary. If a priest wanted to see him, no question, within about a half day, he would see the priest in question, morning, noon, or night. It was that dedication, that simplicity, that integrity that was hugely impactful on me.
As soon as I started working at Word on Fire, it was clear to me that my job is not only in response to Bishop Barron, but in response to Cardinal George. So I have an affection for him just for what he's gifted me in that way. I know you share a very strong affection for the man as well on a personal level.
Yeah, I did. And if you didn't know him well, you just saw the kind of prickly, edgy side. He was a straight-talking Chicagoan, and he wasn't diplomatic.
People could see him as cold, even.
Yeah, and he wasn't, though. That's it. He was almost the opposite. I mean, I thought if you got to know him, you saw he was almost sentimental in the way he dealt with people. There was a real softness about his sort of personal touch. But he was a man of ideas, which I respect. I am too. I'm a man of ideas. And he didn't like, as I don't like, this wedge that we often drive between head and heart, or that, I'm not into all that academic stuff. I'm into the pastoral. See, he found that inimical, that if you're not a man of ideas, you're going to be a lousy pastor, in fact. You might be a good candy striper, but you'll be a lousy pastor of Jesus Christ, And so he didn't buy that. And
interestingly, a lot of the times you say that you grew the closest to him, your fondest memories of him was talking about ideas. That's when you kind of shared hearts.
Yeah. The years I lived there, our schedules didn't, certainly always intersect, but once in a while they would. We'd both be there for dinner. And what he loved, I think what relaxed him the most, at the end of a long day, have a nice dinner, and then he'd stay for 2 hours, 3 hours, if he got interested in something. And what I always tried to do with Cardinal George is get him off of the business side of things, because he was, inundated with that and the practicalities of administration. I would say, hey, this book I'm reading, or like I was, remember Husserl makes his argument against, Descartes, and that would get him going. And we would talk, as I say, 2 hours, 3 hours. And those are very fond memories I have of him. And the laughter, because you get him laughing, and he had the kind of edgy, needling kind of humor. But we would spend a lot of time laughing and talking ideas, and I love that. I appreciate that very much.
Well, now it's time for our listener question, and today's question is a timely one. It comes from Mike, and Mike wants to know what we should think about people who respond to the idea of sending your thoughts and prayers.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Mike. I'm originally from Mundelein, Illinois, but I'm currently stationed in Bremerton, Washington. In light of recent tragedies, such as the shooting in Las Vegas, as well as hurricanes in Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas, how do we respond to critics who say that sending our thoughts and prayers is worthless or even harmful? Thanks for listening.
Yeah, good. And I'm kind of hesitating because it's such an important question. And I know it seems very simple, but I've said this for years. It's one of the most puzzling theological issues, actually, prayer and petitionary prayer. What aren't we doing when we pray? We're not informing God of something that God doesn't know, right? So, by the way, Lord, did you realize there? We're not doing that, We're not, furthermore, trying to change God's mind. We can't change God. God's the unmoved mover. So our prayers don't change God. Like, he's a pasha that is leaning this way, but if I come and I supplicate enough, I might get him to change to what I want. I mean, That can't be right. That makes us the manipulators of God, So what's happening in prayer, but a kind of deep communion with God? When you commune with God, you're expressing your love for God. When you love God, you love everything that God loves and everyone that God loves. So it links you to everyone in and through God. So what are you doing when you pray for somebody, but you're intensifying your awareness of this deep solidarity that you have with the suffering person in God? Is it informing God? No. Is it trying to change God's mind? No. It's establishing a deep intimacy and a deep connection through God. Now, Aquinas will say, for example, might it be the case that in God's providence, he has so ordered things that there'd be a correlation between your asking for something and God deigning to give it? Not that your prayer caused it, that can't be right. But might God have, from all eternity, have deigned that there be a coordination between your asking and his acting? And Thomas says yes. And if you want, that's the deepest theological articulation of what it means to pray for somebody. Now, you see what I mean when I say this is really a deep question that you're asking. It's very hard to answer it succinctly. But I would say basically it's that deep, deep solidarity with the sufferer in and through God that's expressed in prayer. And that's not superficial. And that's, I don't see in any way harmful or damaging. I think that's a beautiful thing.
Thanks so much for listening to the Word on Fire show, and I want to thank Bishop Barron for sharing his experiences with these great men. If you've listened to Bishop Barron's sermons, you know he doesn't really talk about himself very often, so we really appreciate him extending these insights and letting us kind of get a peek inside his own life and his own formation. If you want to hear more of these great stories and learn more about Bishop Barron, but also about Word on Fire and where Word on Fire is headed, make sure you pick up a copy of his new book, To Light a Fire on the Earth. And we'll have a link to it right at our website at wordonfireshow.com. Until next time, we'll see you back here at the Word on Fire show.